The chamber that had always prided itself on measured tones and endless rhetoric quivered with unease the moment humanity's final transmission concluded. What began as murmurs of disbelief swiftly became a gnawing silence as representatives struggled to grasp what they had heard. For centuries, humans had been regarded as ambitious upstarts, unpredictable yet willing to play within the established rules of interstellar diplomacy. They negotiated fiercely, they argued stubbornly, but they always remained seated at the table. That consistency had made them tolerable to the great powers, who dismissed their bluster as the noise of a young civilization still drunk on its rapid expansion. The sudden announcement severing every tie with the Council was not simply unexpected, it was unthinkable. Delegates looked to one another for reassurance, but found only the same widening eyes and coiled tension. The Council had weathered wars, secessions, and rebellions, but never had a member state with such reach and momentum turned its back so completely. The words had been brief, sharp, almost surgical. There had been no preamble, no excuses offered, no appeals for reform. Humanity had spoken with the clarity of final judgment, all diplomatic relations terminated, all accords null, every ambassador recalled. It was as if a door had slammed shut with a finality that shook the very foundations of the chamber. At first, some responded with laughter, brittle and nervous, a reflex against the absurdity of the idea. How could humanity, still considered by many to be an adolescent species, imagine it could walk away from the very structure that legitimized its place among the stars? Yet the laughter died quickly when it became clear that the humans had not merely spoken words. Their embassies were already being evacuated, their delegates escorted out of capital worlds, their flags taken down from shared halls. The retreat was coordinated with precision that revealed weeks, perhaps months, of planning. Humanity had not threatened, they had acted. The council leaders who attempted to dismiss the move as posturing found themselves drowned by reports streaming into the chamber. Communication relays to human systems had gone dark. Negotiations scheduled for the following cycle were abruptly cancelled. Human representatives on multilateral committees had all resigned simultaneously. Nothing in the meticulously crafted history of the Council had prepared it for such a clean, absolute break. Diplomacy relied on tension, on bargaining, on concessions extracted through pressure and threats. Humanity had declined to participate in that dance any longer. They had left the ballroom entirely, and in doing so created a silence more terrifying than open defiance. The panic began quietly, carried in whispers between envoys who calculated the economic and strategic weight now withdrawn. Humans controlled transport routes carved through perilous nebulae where their daring pilots had made safe passage. They had pioneered mining methods in volatile asteroid belts, making them indispensable to entire chains of supply. Their military contingents, once a source of friction, had proven brutally effective in suppressing piracy along neglected frontier zones. Withdrawing all of that in a single stroke was not a gesture, it was a recalibration of the galactic order. Older species, who remembered the chaos before the Council's formation, were the first to recognize the danger. They had seen what unregulated power struggles could become when ambition was unchecked by cooperation. Younger species, who had known only stability under the Council's umbrella, were left gaping at the possibility that the fragile structure they had taken for granted might collapse without the stubborn ballast humanity provided. Questions arose that no one wished to speak aloud. Would humans retaliate for past slights now that they owed the Council nothing? Would they seal their borders and grow into an empire unchecked by oversight? Or would they lash out unpredictably, as their history so often demonstrated when cornered? As the chamber spiraled into confusion, one truth became undeniable. This was not a tantrum. This was not an empty threat designed to extract concessions. Humanity had decided that the Council was no longer necessary, and they had prepared for this moment with ruthless efficiency. The confidence implicit in such a move was what shook the Council most. A weak species bluffs to mask vulnerability. A strong one leaves when it no longer needs permission. The humans had chosen the latter, and the galaxy trembled at the implications. Every attempt to reframe the moment as recoverable collapsed under the weight of reality. The Council could not force a member back into dialogue without provoking war, and humanity had made it clear they would not respond to coercion. The silence of their departure spoke louder than any threat. It carried the weight of finality, the certainty of a species that had calculated the cost and found independence worth any risk. As the doors closed behind the last human envoy, the Council realized it was not simply witnessing a walkout. It was witnessing the end of an era, and perhaps the beginning of something it could neither predict nor control. The withdrawal of humanity from every diplomatic forum spread across the stars like a shockwave no species could escape. The Council's elaborate network of treaties, once regarded as indestructible, began to unravel within days of the announcement. Joint task forces that relied on human crews were abruptly under strength. Merchant convoys that had depended on human starports for refueling now found routes severed, forcing expensive and perilous detours. Every logistical chain had assumed humanity's participation, and without it, the gears of commerce ground unevenly, producing sparks of panic that lit fires in markets and ministries alike. The first consequence was economic. Humanity's colonies produced a variety of rare elements mined from extreme environments most species considered unworkable. Their techniques for extracting metals from superheated asteroids or harvesting isotopes from unstable moons had been regarded as reckless but profitable. With those shipments abruptly halted, prices surged, currencies trembled, and long-standing trade arrangements collapsed in a matter of hours. Panic buying erupted across dozens of systems as fear outpaced reason, and by the time calmer voices tried to impose order, the spiral had already taken hold. The Council's financial committees, stripped of human representatives, discovered how brittle their models truly were without the stabilizing influence of human reliability. The second consequence was military. While humanity had not fielded the largest fleets, their vessels had a reputation for aggressive tactics that made them disproportionately valuable in joint patrols. Pirate bands and smugglers had long since learned to avoid sectors where human destroyers prowled, knowing the cost of underestimating them. Withdrawing those patrols opened corridors of lawlessness overnight. Raids increased, caravans were lost, and the perception of Council control began to fray. Species that had grown complacent under the security umbrella now scrambled to reinforce borders, suddenly aware that the humans had been the keystone in an arrangement none of them had fully appreciated. The third consequence was psychological. Rumors multiplied faster than official statements could contain them. Some claimed humanity was consolidating its power for an expansionist campaign. Others insisted they were developing new weapons, the secrecy of their research interpreted as proof of apocalyptic designs. Even species with no direct human contact felt the ripple of unease, for the sudden silence left a void filled with speculation. The humans had always been outspoken, blunt to the point of rudeness, but their words had provided clarity. The absence of those words left only dread. Within the Council chamber, attempts to restore order faltered. Committees convened, reports were presented, debates flared, but every discussion returned to the same paralyzing question: what do the humans intend? None could answer. Intelligence agencies admitted their surveillance had been blindsided by the speed of the withdrawal. Merchant guilds warned that continued uncertainty would destroy entire sectors of commerce. Military planners quietly confessed that contingency strategies had never accounted for the loss of humanity as an ally, and now the models had no predictive value. Every scenario seemed to end with instability cascading beyond control. Whispers grew into open accusations. Certain factions blamed those who had most antagonized humanity in recent decades. Others argued the Council's arrogance had pushed too far, treating a resilient species as though it would always accept humiliation. Old grievances resurfaced, as rival powers accused one another of encouraging human withdrawal for hidden advantage. In truth, none of the accusations mattered. The chaos was real, and every faction was too busy shielding itself to cooperate on a solution. As instability deepened, minor powers looked to secure their own survival. Some began reaching out to human systems in secret, sending envoys without Council sanction in the desperate hope of forging bilateral agreements. Others fortified borders, fearing that the silence hid a buildup of fleets. Trade cartels diverted resources into stockpiles, betting that scarcity would only worsen. The Council, once a body of unity, was reduced to an arena of fear-driven opportunism, each member reacting without coordination. The irony became unbearable for those old enough to remember the Council's founding. The institution had been created to prevent the very collapse now unfolding, to bind disparate species into a cooperative order stronger than the sum of its parts. Yet a single species, by choosing departure, had exposed how hollow that unity truly was. The humans had not fired a weapon, issued a threat, or delivered an ultimatum. They had simply walked away, and the edifice shook as though an earthquake had struck its foundation. The more the panic spread, the clearer it became that the crisis was not about material losses alone. It was about perception. The Council had assumed permanence, yet humanity's departure revealed it was fragile, its stability dependent on those least trusted to maintain it. Every world that watched trade falter and security weaken was forced to acknowledge that the so-called adolescent species had been the glue holding the alliance together. Their absence was not a gap that could be easily filled. It was a wound that would bleed until the galaxy found a way to adapt, or collapse entirely. The Council convened in endless sessions, yet no amount of speech could hide the growing terror at the heart of their deliberations. Every species had its own measure of fear, but the common thread was the unpredictability of humanity. For centuries, interstellar politics had been guided by rules, expectations, and a rhythm of threats balanced by concessions. Patterns could be analyzed, intentions mapped, and probabilities calculated with comforting precision. Humanity had always been an anomaly in those equations, but as long as they remained engaged, their impulses were moderated by the rituals of diplomacy. With that restraint gone, the unknown loomed larger than any fleet. Delegates recited case studies with the desperation of scholars trying to make sense of a force of nature. One recalled how humanity had reinvented entire strategies in the middle of wars, shifting from defense to counterattack with no warning. Another cited their willingness to gamble everything on unconventional maneuvers that more cautious civilizations would never attempt. What struck the chamber most deeply was the pattern. When cornered, humans refused the safe option. They embraced risk, and somehow survived it. That record meant predictions could no longer comfort the nervous. The only certainty was that the humans would do something no one expected, and that realization ate at every calculation. Intelligence briefings arrived, filled with blackout data streams and encrypted channels no analyst could penetrate. Laboratories once monitored by the Council's oversight committees now operated in absolute silence. Military movements were obscured behind new layers of deception. Merchant vessels vanished from shared patrols, reappearing only in strictly human territory. What little could be pieced together suggested deliberate obfuscation, a coordinated effort to erase the Council's ability to know what was happening within human borders. To those long accustomed to the illusion of transparency, the blackout was more alarming than open hostility. Secrecy implied intent, and intent without explanation became indistinguishable from threat. As debates dragged on, tempers frayed. Some argued for immediate shows of strength, convinced that if pressure were not applied quickly, humanity would emerge from isolation with a power none could match. Others warned that such action would only accelerate disaster, for history had shown that threats galvanize human resolve rather than breaking it. That paradox left the Council paralyzed, trapped between fearing the consequences of action and fearing the consequences of inaction. The chamber filled with accusations, yet beneath the shouting was a shared dread, humanity's capacity to make the impossible real. Veteran statesmen reminded their peers of humanity's resourcefulness in situations others deemed hopeless. They had turned environmental wastelands into thriving colonies, engineered weapons from scrap during sieges, and transformed technological limitations into advantages through sheer ingenuity. These anecdotes, meant to offer perspective, only deepen the unease. A species that treated constraints as challenges rather than barriers was not one to be safely underestimated. Every story became proof that the humans, given independence, might emerge with capabilities far beyond what anyone dared project. Even the elder civilizations, whose lifespans stretched back to ages before humanity's first sparks of industry, admitted privately that they no longer understood the balance of power. They had seen species rise and fall, but none had grown at humanity's pace. None had shown such willingness to endure hardship without surrender. That resilience, once seen as admirable, now appeared dangerous. It suggested that humans could suffer through economic strangulation, military blockade, or diplomatic isolation and still find a path forward. They were not bound by the caution that had made other empires predictable. The fear crystallized in a single realization spoken aloud by one weary elder. The galaxy did not fear what humanity had already built, but what it might build now that no one was watching. That truth silenced the chamber. All attempts to rationalize, to comfort, to calculate fell away before the enormity of not knowing. A power that acted within the council could be managed, negotiated, restrained. A power that rejected all oversight could only be guessed at, and guesses offered no stability. In the absence of certainty, terror filled the void. Thus the council found itself confronting an adversary without a declaration of war, without a mobilization of fleets, without a single shot fired. The danger lay not in what humanity had done, but in what it might choose to do next. That ambiguity unraveled every strategy, eroded every alliance, and cast a shadow over every discussion. For the first time in generations, the galaxy understood that its greatest threat was not aggression, but unpredictability. Humanity had chosen to step outside the framework, and the Council's calculations crumbled in the silence that followed. Humanity's withdrawal was not a retreat born of weakness, but a deliberate act shaped by long memory and quiet determination. For decades they had endured condescension, endured treaties that bound them more tightly than others, endured sanctions levied for behaviors the elder powers themselves practiced in secret. Each insult had been catalogued, each humiliation stored, and though humans argued among themselves, when the final choice came they moved as one. The severing of diplomacy was less an explosion than a carefully executed maneuver, born from a collective decision that enough was enough. On Earth and across the colonies, the announcement was met not with confusion but with resolve. Populations that had grown tired of watching their representatives return from council halls with clipped compromises now stood united. Industries once constrained by regulations written to favor alien competitors were suddenly unshackled. Researchers celebrated the end of oversight committees that had stifled experimentation. Military leaders, long forced to justify every action to suspicious observers, finally had authority to plan without constraint. The fracture from the Council became a moment of cohesion for humanity itself, a rare alignment of civilian will, economic ambition, and strategic vision. The first acts of independence were not declarations of conquest but demonstrations of control. Borders once porous with Council-authorized traffic hardened overnight, defended by patrols that now answered only to human command. Trade routes once shared were reorganized, with tariffs and permissions dictated solely by human law. Rather than collapsing in isolation, the human economy began to reorient inward, leveraging self-sufficiency and stockpiles prepared for precisely this contingency. Outsiders interpreted the efficiency of these measures as evidence of long planning, and they were right. Humanity had anticipated this moment, not as a fantasy but as an inevitability. What set them apart was not the scale of their fleets or the wealth of their worlds, but the philosophy that underpinned their response. Humans had never been content to measure power only in numbers. Their strength lay in adaptability, in the conviction that no obstacle was insurmountable if approached with creativity and resolve. Where others saw the Council as the axis of civilization, humans saw it as one more structure in a universe of shifting structures. If that structure constrained them, they would discard it, just as they had discarded failed systems throughout their history. That clarity, once muted by diplomacy, now guided every decision. To the galaxy, the silence of humanity's stance was louder than threats. They did not broadcast ultimatums, they did not demand concessions, they did not posture with parades of warships. They simply turned inward, working, building, innovating without explanation. One message was transmitted across neutral channels, brief and unmistakable: we do not require your approval. We will not be bound. We do not seek war, but we will never kneel. For those accustomed to parsing flowery declarations filled with hidden conditions, the bluntness was terrifying. It left no avenue for negotiation, no weakness to exploit. Behind that declaration was unity born of pride and anger. Citizens who had once doubted their leaders now rallied around the idea that their destiny would not be dictated by distant species. Colonists on frontier worlds spoke of the chance to expand without oversight. Engineers accelerated projects shelved for fear of council intervention. Propulsion experiments, energy research, defensive constructs previously considered too destabilizing. Each breakthrough would be theirs alone, answers to no one, and the knowledge of that progress leaking into rumor was enough to unsettle the rest of the galaxy. The military posture mirrored this philosophy. No great fleet reviews, no saber-rattling maneuvers, only steady reinforcement of defenses, quiet movements of assets, and disciplined silence. To outside observers it was impossible to know if humans were preparing for war or simply safeguarding independence, and in that uncertainty lay the most powerful deterrent. A species that did not crave conquest but would not tolerate coercion created a dilemma no rival could solve. Thus humanity's stance crystallized into something more dangerous than aggression, independence that could not be shaken. They had shown they could walk away from the greatest alliance ever assembled without hesitation. They had shown they would endure uncertainty without fear. And most of all, they had shown the will to define their own path, regardless of who trembled in the shadows of their choice. In their silence, they spoke volumes, and the galaxy listened with unease, knowing that control had slipped forever from its grasp. The absence of humanity from the Council became a wound that deepened with every passing cycle. Attempts to mask the fracture with proclamations of unity fell flat as the consequences multiplied. Trade convoys grew irregular, shortages spread, and once stable sectors fractured under strain. Entire economies that had relied on human routes and expertise began to falter, and when petitions were raised for immediate intervention, the Council found itself powerless to respond. Where humans had once anchored chaos with stubborn determination, there was now only instability that no coalition could contain. Desperation pushed minor powers into quiet defiance of the very authority they once revered. Delegations traveled in secrecy to human worlds, offering treaties and trade under the table. They reasoned that survival mattered more than loyalty to an alliance that could no longer guarantee prosperity or safety. Each clandestine arrangement further eroded the Council's credibility, for it revealed a truth long denied: without humanity, the Council was not feared, respected, or obeyed. It was tolerated only as long as it served practical needs, and those needs were rapidly vanishing. Among the great empires, divisions grew sharper. Some argued for appeasement, insisting that humility and concessions might lure humanity back into dialogue. Others demanded confrontation before the balance shifted too far, warning that every day of silence allowed humans to grow stronger. Both positions tore at the Council's fragile unity, and neither produced action. Threats carried no certainty of success, while begging for forgiveness risked humiliation. Paralysis became the only consistent outcome, and paralysis in the face of crisis meant collapse. The rumors surrounding humanity's activities grew darker with each passing month. Merchant captains spoke of strange new ship designs glimpsed at the edges of human space. Spies whispered of research stations producing results decades ahead of predicted timelines. Stories of hidden alliances circulated, some claiming entire border states had already pledged allegiance to Earth. None of the rumors could be confirmed, yet their very persistence fed the spiral of fear. The less the galaxy knew, the more it believed, and belief alone was enough to alter strategies, shift economies, and stoke militaries to readiness. A final effort was made to restore dialogue. Envoys, chosen from respected species thought to carry neutral weight, were dispatched with carefully worded appeals. They carried offers of reconciliation, promises of reform, even apologies. The emissaries returned with nothing. In most cases, they were denied entry. In others, they were received politely but coldly, and dismissed without commitment. No demands were issued in return, no ultimatums placed on the table. Humanity did not bargain. They did not threaten. They simply refused to answer to those who had treated them as less than equal. That refusal carried more weight than fleets or armies, because it revealed indifference to the Council's power. By then the truth was undeniable. Humanity did not need the Council. The Council, however, could not survive without humanity. Its legitimacy eroded each day, its chambers echoed with bickering rather than leadership. Its stability crumbled as member states sought safety in bilateral agreements beyond its reach. Its authority dissolved as its decrees went unenforced. In the shadow of humanity's independence, the Great Alliance was revealed as hollow, a monument to order that had only endured because one obstinate species refused to let it fail. The panic that had begun as murmurs now dominated every gathering. Leaders who once spoke with certainty now whispered in private, calculating how long their own worlds could withstand the new order. The irony grew impossible to ignore. The Council had dismissed humanity as reckless, dangerous, undisciplined, and yet it was humanity's departure that exposed the galaxy's fragility. By choosing sovereignty over submission, they had changed the axis of power without firing a single shot. What remained was not simply fear of war, but recognition of freedom. A species had proven it could walk away from the most powerful institution in history and stand taller for it. That knowledge spread farther and faster than fleets, planting seeds of doubt in every corner of the galaxy. If the humans could reject the chains of tradition and survive, why not others? The Council panicked not only at the loss of control over humanity but at the possibility that humanity's example might inspire others to break free as well. The galaxy had believed itself the center, the arbiter of what was possible and what was not. Humanity's refusal to bow revealed the illusion. They had declared by action alone that they would define their own destiny, and in doing so had forced the stars to reckon with them. The Council's collapse was not marked by battles or treaties but by a silence it could not fill. In that silence, one truth endured: nothing was more dangerous than a species that no longer asked for permission.